Hello and welcome along to the next part of the course. Here we're going to be looking at the real-world bus industry ahead of the MCS May 2018 exam. Before I begin, let me just give you a quick overview of exactly what we'll be covering in this industry analysis. In the first section, we're going to focus primarily on macro trends. We're going to be looking at it from primarily a quantitative perspective, issues surrounding bus usage and demand, and also some key financial monetary figures and statistics. We're going to start in the UK and move outwards then to the EU and then the global perspective, and there are a number of reasons why we'll be starting with the UK, which I'll explain in a few moments. In the second section then, we're going to focus on the government and the role that it tends to play in bus markets around the world. In most modern industrialized nations, you will see the government playing a very strong role still, despite the privatizations that occurred primarily in the mid-80s and early 90s. There's still a huge amount of influence coming from government policy when it comes to bus markets, and we'll look at some examples of that in the second section and explain the implications. And then in the third section, we're going to focus on changes, both recent changes that have occurred already and changes that are likely to occur in the coming years. Primarily, we'll be focusing on technology issues and issues pertaining to energy and fuel usage. Then in the final section, we are going to look at some opportunities and threats faced by bus operators within this industry. Issues pertaining to smart technology, green initiatives, sharing economy, politics, and a number of other considerations as well. And then we'll wrap up and finish off there. Okay, so let's start with this issue of the UK and England. Why are we starting with the UK and England? Well, the reason is because there are very many similarities between the pre-scene market and industry structure and the one that is currently in place in the UK and indeed more specifically in England. First of all, we have a deregulated and privatised industry from around the mid-1980s, breaking up national companies and selling them off or privatising them. That occurred under the Thatcher government, of course, and the national government regulations and policy levers that currently are in place include subsidy, statutory concessionary travel, licensing and quality regulation, competition law, and best practice guidance. That's at the national level. And then at the local level as well, there are a number of distinct regulations and policy levers: competitively tendered supported services, discretionary concessionary travel, targeted capital funding, planning and infrastructure management. As we'll see in Centralia, a number of parallels here, both in terms of the regulation issue and privatisation, and also in terms of the current policy and government levers that are in place. So again, a deregulated and privatised industry that occurred from around the mid-1980s, as we're told in the pre-scene, breaking up national companies and selling them off and privatising them, as in the real world UK and English contexts. Regulations and policy levers there in Centralia include local government subsidies, licensing and quality regulation, statutory concessionary travel, and competitively tendered services. So again, a number of parallels there on that front as well. And for that reason, I think it's fair to suppose that the UK and England in particular are some kind of model for the pre-scene industry that we're looking at. And that's why I'm going to start with a focus on the UK and then move outwards to Europe and the rest of the world, because of course the company in the pre-scene isn't just focused on Centralia, it's also focused on a number of other regions. The timeline, of course, parallels and structural overlaps between the UK and Centralia seem to suggest then that the UK is a good approximate model for the Centralia industry. So if you want to do a deep dive further based on some of the sources that we include at the end of this presentation, deep dive into the UK a little bit more, feel free to do so. Okay, so we'll start with the English bus industry then. Here we're looking at a chart that tracks bus journeys per capita since the 1990s until 2014. Now you'll notice here it's divided into a number of different segments, and the one with the most changes and indeed the biggest increases in this period have been in London. Now London, as the capital city, it receives a disproportionate amount of funding from the central government, and so for that reason perhaps it shouldn't surprise us to see that it has fared better in terms of bus journeys per capita. We've also seen a great deal of expansion in that city over the last 20 years or so, A lot of people moving into the surrounding areas, as well as we see commuters coming in from the outskirts of that city. And so the demand as well has increased and attracts the investment from the government. So not surprising there. The more interesting and perhaps telling statistic here is in the other areas: English metropolitan, English non-metropolitan, and the English average. We've seen, if anything, a slight downward trend on average between those three segments. More or less flat for two of the segments, and then a downward trend there you can see in English metropolitan areas in general, suggesting that the demand for bus services is more or less static or stagnant in this period in those areas. We haven't seen a great deal of growth. Let's move on then to the next section here, and this looks at London in particular as one of the greatest recipients of funding from the local government. You can see here total net support by the central and local government for bus services and a concessionary travel by area type, and this is from 1996, so a close enough parallel to the previous slide that you've seen there in terms of the time frame. And unsurprisingly, you can see London there tracks more or less that figure that we saw in the previous section, going up steadily from 1996. So government investment in London has been much more extensive than in other areas. You can see there the metropolitan areas, it's been more or less flat since 1996-97. And then in non-met areas in more recent years, there's been an increase in the investment from the local and central governments. And we'll come back to that in a few slides in more detail. So the capital, unsurprisingly perhaps, receiving the lion's share of funding from the central government. So you can see here, this is an interesting and quite telling little graph. It's comparing the trends of both local bus and national rail in terms of, you can see here, local bus accounted for 59% of all public transport journeys in Great Britain, but this has fallen from 74% in 1991-92, and this change, it says, has been driven by large increases in patronage on the national rail network, London Underground, and light rail and modern tram systems. So here we're seeing the percentage of public transport journeys by local bus and national rail network. So this is in the public transport context, I should say, all the way back from 1950 until the present day. And we've seen that as national rail has gone up, local bus has gone down in terms of its percentage. Perhaps not surprising, because of course national rail is in a way a substitute for local bus services. And so one must bear in mind in this industry, in this context, that bus operators are not only competing with other bus operators, but also with other modes of public transport and indeed private transport, and we'll come back to that point later on. But this is an important thing to realize, is that often you'll see these kinds of links and patterns between bus services and other modes of transport, and that can suggest that there is a negative impact on bus from the popularity or the rising popularity of other modes of transport, and that's something to bear in mind. Now let's move outwards a little bit in terms of the perspective and look at some EU data. Here you can see this graph. It's difficult really to detect any obvious trends in modes of transport over the last 20 years, apart from the obvious relative rise in air travel you can see there. So air has obviously made the biggest strides in relative terms, but more or less a kind of steady split there you can see over those years. Apart from the increase in absolute numbers, the actual breakdown in terms of the different modes of transport in the EU in terms of averages hasn't really seen, there aren't really any very discernible trends there, but we'll zoom in anyway on these, on some of the percentages here. When you actually look at it in terms of these percentages, there are some telling patterns. If you look here, for example, at buses and coaches, that's minus 1%. This is passenger transport volumes in terms per kilometre across the different modes over since 2000, over the last, say, 18 years. And that shows that buses and coaches, of all the segments here, it's the only one in negative growth, apart from the C at the bottom there. But in terms of terrestrial transport, buses and coaches by far is faring the worst. And look here at these modes of transport, the public modes of transport, railway and trams, plus 28% for trams and metro, and plus 19% for railways. So if we're looking at those two modes of transport as potential competition for bus operators, the picture there really is a rather negative one and a worrying one from the point of view of the bus industry in general since 2000 across the EU. These are EU averages we're considering. And so the trends all seem to point in the direction of a shrinking bus and coach market. So despite the fact that the bus market, as we saw in the case of England back here, it still is accounting for the largest percentage of public transport journeys, it does seem to be in decline relative to other modes of transport. And that seems to be the case across the EU, not just in the UK. So in absolute terms, still in a relatively strong position, but in terms of trends and in terms of growth, it's actually in a rather weak position, and there are some worrying signs. So let's look at the country-to-country comparisons in the context of the EU. As you can see here, there's a great deal of variability from country to country in terms of the proportion of public journeys going to trains, the proportion going to buses and trams, and then the proportion going to passenger cars. Obviously and unsurprisingly, passenger cars comprise the greatest proportion in terms of overall transport modes across the EU from country to country. But then from the perspective of the public transport options in terms of trains and buses, you can see there's quite a bit of variability between each country, and that has a great deal to do with the different rates and levels of government investment. And so the government really is playing a crucial role here when it comes to splits between trains and buses. Looking at a global perspective now, the number of daily passengers using bus rapid transit systems in 2015, when you see that phrase bus rapid transit system, that specifically refers to bus systems in which there are dedicated lanes and infrastructure for buses in particular. What you're seeing here is Latin America by far and away has the greatest numbers in terms of daily passengers, and that seems to be the region where the bus is the most popular in terms of absolute numbers by far and away. In second place then Asia Pacific, and then you're seeing the Middle East and North Africa in third, and then Europe and North America in fourth and fifth respectively. And what this seems to suggest is that when it comes to bus numbers, bus usage in absolute terms, the greatest demand and the greatest usage seems to be in the developing countries and emerging markets, whereas when you look at the more industrialized nations, specifically in Europe and North America, they're trailing behind in terms of bus numbers, and that might suggest that governments in those countries are shifting their focus more to rail and perhaps even metros and undergrounds as the preferred modes of public transport. And that again is a worrying sign for those companies that are primarily getting their revenues in Europe and North America. And as we saw in the pre-scene, Centralia as a European country, and it seems that the company in the pre-scene is really focused on Europe, Menta, and that this is perhaps a worrying sign or signal that there's a decline of popularity and hence in government investment. And as we'll see, we'll come back to this in the case of UK, there have been signs and suggestions that in recent years the government in the UK is seriously considering cutting back on the services and the amount of funding that's going to buses. Here we see, this is a really interesting little graph actually in terms of the link and the relationship between demand for cars and popularity of cars and the demand for buses. As you can see here, if you focus just on these two and ignore trains and tubes for the moment, we're looking at the percentage of commuters that are using cars and percentages that are using the bus. And this is in 1960, 1980 and 2000, and a 20-year gap between each of these bars here in this graph. The car rises steadily from 1960 to 2000, and the bus, as you can see, declines steadily in that same period. And notice that they track each other very, very closely in terms of percentages and the nature of the decline. And this strongly suggests that bus and car as well are in close competition as alternative modes of transport. And so with the rising popularity of the car, the bus seems to suffer. As we'll see later on as well, this may be actually one relative positive sign, as we're seeing that cars, in terms of government policy, are being targeted negatively. Governments are primarily interested in reducing the number of cars in city centre zones. They're trying to improve infrastructure for non-carbon emitting modes of transport increasingly. And when it comes to zoning and planning, this is increasingly the case with industrialized nations. And so the car, as a city centre mode of transport at least, is, it seems, being targeted, and this might actually be a benefit and a boon to bus operators. But that depends on a number of other factors which we'll be considering as we go along in the rest of this industry analysis. When it comes to predictions then, we've got the United Nations here, and they have made projections that by 2030, over 60% of the global population will live in urban areas, which may result in declining automobile ownership, as cities may take further actions to promote bicycle and public transport usage to deter usage of conventional automobiles. So as I just suggested, this is a target, it seems, of government policy in urban areas, and this could be a boon for buses, but not only buses, of course, also other modes of public transport in city centre and urban zones, metros or undergrounds included, and indeed rail. So what are the implications of all of these numbers that we've been looking at? Well, first of all, bus usage trends, whether in the UK, EU or worldwide, have shown considerable declines in the last half century, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any radical turnaround anytime soon in that trend. In more recent years, declines have been a little bit less dramatic, around 1% in both Europe and the UK in the last 10 years in terms of overall uptake. But there is the issue of the other modes of public transport and how they're faring, and it seems that in terms of growth prospects, those alternative modes of public transport are really in a much better growth position, and that may be worrying for the bus operators. In terms of public transport, the bus remains the predominant mode in absolute numbers, as I've said, but you've got to bear in mind those rather pessimistic growth numbers. So relative growth in the context of public transport, the bus is in a bad situation, it would seem. Rail, underground and tram are the big growers in terrain-based public transport. There are also indications that in terms of broader competition conditions, car usage appears to be the most direct competitor with bus. We saw that in that close kind of parallel inverse pattern between car growth over the years and bus growth. There's also huge variation both within and between countries, and of course this indicates that government investment in different modes of public transport seems to be a considerable factor, and per capita usage appears to be highest in developing nations and regions as opposed to developed or indeed undeveloped nations. So you need some level of government support and investment, and it seems that the popularity of the bus is highest in those developing countries and regions like Latin America and the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, let's focus more closely then on this issue of government and their influence over bus markets. Here we have a nice little model or overview, visual overview of the structure of the English government involvement in the bus industry. You can see here you've got a number of different sources of government influence. First of all, from the central government, in terms of taxation, taxing bus operators, but also this BSOG, which stands for the Bus Service Operators Grant. I'll explain a little bit more detail what exactly this is, but it's one source of funding that goes to bus operators directly from the central government. You also then have a BSOG for supported services, that is the tendered services, which are determined by the local transport authorities across England. You also have other block grants such as the BBAF, which is the Better Bus Areas Fund, which again I'll explain in a couple of minutes, and the LSTF, which is the Local Sustainable Transport Fund. And these are going to the local authorities, and they then determine which operators are entitled to these different sources of funding based on competitive tendering, among other kinds of applications. There's also the concessionary travel reimbursements coming from local authorities. And you've got local transport policy as well in terms of investment in things like infrastructure, traffic management and service information. This is investment in other other aspects of the industry outside of the operators. So this money is not going directly to the operators. This local transport policy money is being invested in things like infrastructure and supports for bus operators that they can benefit from, but that they do not have any direct control over in terms of decision making. And then you also have the traffic commissioner here at the bottom, and they're responsible for licensing and regulations imposed on the bus industry. And you've got also the operators then in the other direction registering their commercial services with the traffic commissioner. So when a new bus operator comes into existence, they would register their commercial services with the traffic commissioner. And then the other stakeholder here on the right you can see is, of course, the passenger and their revenues coming in, for the fares from the passengers obviously being a considerable source of revenue for the bus operators. But you have a number of different sources, and actually you'll see that the majority of the different sources are coming from indeed central government and local government funding. This is the case as well in the pre-scene. There was a really large amount of funding coming from the government sources. So we'll come back to that in a moment and consider the implications of that. But here you can see for the English government in the real world, a number of different policies and ways of influencing the bus industry, and this applies at both the national level and indeed at the local level. So here at the top you can see these are national policy levers: taxes and subsidies, statutory concessionary travel, licensing and quality regulation, competition law, and best practice guidance. Now, best practice guidance, this isn't actually a legal requirement. These are just kind of voluntary guidelines that are issued by the government, and so it's not really exactly a strong policy lever, but it does issue these guidelines as well at the national level. Then at the local level you have supported services, which is tendered services, that is to say, so the local authority will sell the right to run a particular route to a bus operator that applies successfully and convincingly and shows that they can actually run a profitable service in that particular area, given the funding and support from the local authority. You also have discretionary concessionary travel. So this is, again, things like people with disabilities and elderly people, or maybe students and young people. The local authorities can issue additional concessionary travel to the statutory concessionary travel that applies at the national level in order to incentivize uptake and usage of the buses. Targeted capital funding, this would be primarily investment in facilities, bus stops and things like that. Perhaps even extending routes and lines or bus lanes. Planning, infrastructure investment and traffic management as well is responsibility of the local authorities. Highway demand management and municipal bus operator services. So a huge number, really, when you think about it, a huge number of ways that the government at both the central and local level can have an influence on the success or failure, indeed, of the bus industry. So what are these BSOG, BBAF and LSTFs that I mentioned? Well, the BSOG stands for the Bus Service Operators Grant. It's a kind of fuel rebate or support that local services may claim. So what is the definition of local? Well, local is defined in the English context as routes wherein bus stops are not more than 15 miles apart. So when it comes to the long city, intercity routes, I should say, generally these cannot be claimed. The BSOG cannot be claimed by companies who are, for example, only running intercity routes. These rebates can only be claimed for buses and services that are running on local or indeed inner city routes where the stops are not more than 15 miles apart. We'll come back to that again in a little more detail, just look at some of the numbers applying to that fuel duty rebate and the BSOG. Then we have the BBAF, or the Better Bus Areas Fund, and this is a competitively allocated fund to local authorities. In other words, local authorities actually have to justify their being granted this fund by the central government with some kind of case for requirements of infrastructure. So, for example, if a particular local authority feels that there is excessive usage of particular routes, or that the upkeep of certain infrastructure is subpar, they can make their case to the central government and receive this Better Bus Areas Fund. So again, competitively allocated, but not competitively allocated directly to the operators. Rather, this goes to the local authorities, and it assists with, as I said, infrastructure development. Then finally, the LSTF is the Local Sustainable Transport Fund, also a competitively allocated fund in the same way as for the BBAF, with a focus primarily on reducing carbon emissions and pollution coming from public transport. So here we just look at the BSOG in a bit more detail. This is the guidelines coming from the central government. It's a grant paid to operators of eligible bus services, that is to say local bus services and community transport organisations, to help them recover some of the fuel costs. The amount of each bus operator receives is based on their annual fuel consumption. And the aim is to benefit passengers by helping operators keep fares down and enabling operators to run services that might otherwise be unprofitable and might otherwise be cancelled. So this is the way in which the tendered services, work in the England. This BSOG is kind of a way of compensating bus operators for routes that might otherwise not be sustainable from a profit-making perspective. Here you can see the breakdown of the kinds of numbers that we're looking at. So this is the duty that's paid per different kinds of fuel: diesel, biodiesel, bioethanol, unleaded petrol and natural gas. And the amount of the rebate for each of these duties can be seen on the right there. And diesel has, along with biodiesel, has the highest rebate amount. And going down then to unleaded petrol, you can see it's down to 32.66 pence per litre for every 57.95 pence paid. And then you have natural gas and other types of gas at the bottom. So obviously unleaded petrol and diesel will be the most common. We also see that in the primary motivations of government interventions seem to be based ultimately on these environmental considerations, and we saw there that the LSTF as well is a separate fund that is just completely focused on reducing carbon emissions and polluting transport. But all of these funds taken together are a huge source of revenue and support for the bus industry as a whole. And without all of these different levers, these different sources of funding, it's hard to know how the actual bus operators would fare in a purely competitive environment. And so this is really crucial to the survival in many cases of bus routes and bus services throughout England. Now, unsurprisingly, this is a very heavily politicized industry because of the amount of government involvement that's still there. So it's really a privatized industry in many ways in name only when you compare it to other privatized industries. The amount of support and crutches coming from the government is really, really vast and considerable. And for that reason, there is a great deal of politicization and indeed emotiveness when it comes to this industry in England. Lots of people are worried that the bus industry is going to suffer a great deal if the government decides at any moment to withdraw funding or to reduce its funding for the bus services. And so we have this campaign for better transport in England, which isn't only focused on the bus operators and the bus industry, but also on other modes of public transport. But they are very concerned about the bus industry because of the degree to which they're relying on government support and subsidies. You can see here that in recent times, and this is in 2015, the Save Our Buses team was campaigning tirelessly for over 4 months against rumours that the government was going to drastically cut funding to the bus operators through these various funding mechanisms that we just looked at. They were campaigning tirelessly and they were mobilising a coalition of charities, NGOs and trade unions and lobbying friendly MPs to support their campaign. So you can see here quite a broad coalition of stakeholders and concerned parties, and this is characteristic of the industry. You see a great deal of political pressure coming from not just from concerned citizen groups like the Campaign for Better Transport, but indeed from people within the industry as well, and people who are involved in terms of like trade unions. But you will also see on occasion that bus operators themselves support these kinds of movements and are agitating and lobbying governments to maintain the supports that are already in place or indeed to extend them further.